Welcome Temple University, Japan. Just a few things. If you have a mobile, put it on vibrate. If you didn't get an invitation, you can give us your business cards. We have a box here. You can give them to me. I'm Robert Dejarik. I work at Temple University. And brevity is a sort of wit. So you've obviously all read Noelle's bio. So I will just give her the floor. And I won't bore you. I assume you don't want a 10-minute introduction for me to introduce you to the person who will then introduce you. So here it is. Thanks very much.
Yes, that's kind of American style, I suppose, so it makes me feel at home to jump right to the issue at hand. Well, thanks to all of you for coming out on a weeknight, late after a work day, to join the conversation tonight. That's kind of the way that I see it. I'm very grateful to Robert for the kind invitation to think aloud with you tonight about the place of a historical Japan in a 21st century maritime world. This is maybe a topic or a subject I've been mulling over the last several months since I've been in Japan, working mostly out of Sapporo and Hokkaido University, researching the last bits of a book on U.S. whalers in the 19th century North Pacific and their contributions to the creation of Japan as a Pacific nation. But tonight, part of what I also want to think about, and that's really grabbed my interest over the last several months, are about the goals of the Meiji 150th anniversary, the restoration commemorative events, which began at the start of 2018, and particularly what they tell us about Japan's past, but more importantly, about its present as a maritime Pacific nation. So this year, as many of you will know, 2018, marks the sesquicentennial of the beginning of the Meiji era. And although special events have been ongoing since January, they may not have been on your radar. But they surround us today in Tokyo, including many different venues and exhibitions, including one going on about the revolution in diplomacy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on the genesis of modern map making at the Japan Coast Guard Archives. And I should also mention, for those of you connected to Tokyo University, a great digitized collection of Meiji period photographs is just coming out, and at a variety of other museums and venues around the city. But before I jump into that, in my parallel life, when I run out of credible excuses to live in Japan, where have I been since last summer, my home base is actually the US South, specifically the state of Mississippi, where I teach at the University of Mississippi in a small town called Oxford. Yes, this Oxford is in fact named after the original Oxford, but it's better known for being the hometown of the Nobel Prize-winning author, William Faulkner. Faulkner played an interesting role in Cold War cultural exchange with his 1955 visit to Japan, including a visit here in Tokyo and afterwards at Nagano. Even today, tourists can view mementos of this trip at his family home in Oxford. But as many fans of vending machine coffee are aware, his most visible legacy today may be the Faulkner-esque profile that we see on Boss cans, such as the one around the corner at 7-Eleven. Probably because I too have been partial to these heated cans in a long Hokkaido winter. As I was mulling over ideas for today, a quote from his 1951 novel, Requiem for a Nun, came to mind, one that former President Barack Obama has also used as well. And that quote is, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." This notion seemed a useful starting point to justify a talk by a historian like me, and part of my work actually dips back as early as the 16th century. But this notion seemed useful for a historian like me in an institute of contemporary Asian studies such as this. So on the Japanese government's Meiji 150th website, too, a stated goal for these year-long celebrations is to examine how we can apply the lessons of both Meiji's successes and failures in the 21st century. And I'm going to offer a few brief thoughts tonight from the perspective of a historian based in Hokkaido on what some of these lessons might be. Now, one important difference between the 100th anniversary celebrations, which occurred in 1968, exactly a century after the Meiji Restoration, and those of this year, is that this time the Prime Minister's office, the Kante, is mobilizing nationwide events. So, of course, many political pundits and journalists have commented that Mr. Abe and his administration seem particularly interested to leverage Meiji militarization as a tool to justify constitutional revision. Other observers, including journalists in the major Japanese press, as well as historians in the April issue of Chuo Koron, suggest that the most important lessons are the creation of meritocracy, improvements in the status of women and larger diversification, and internationalization, just to name a few. But I would like to play contrarian and suggest that an additional and equally important lesson is that of Japan's engagement with the surrounding oceans and emergence as a Pacific nation. Scrutinizing the year-long events planned to celebrate this sesquicentennial, both in Tokyo and Hokkaido, offers important clues about how this happened. So here we have the official logo, which was announced after much fanfare in a national competition. You might have followed in the press. Some papers carried it in excruciating detail, which is the kind of the logo mark or emblem of this year's commemoration, which interestingly contains both the Japanese characters and I think importantly, Meiji 150th in English, to maybe allude to the kind of global international aspect of the original kind of historical moment, but also to try to engage, I think, an international audience in thinking about the meanings of this period for the present day. So I titled my talk, Historical Japan in a 21st Century Maritime Pacific World, precisely because these celebrations invite us to revisit the importance of the 19th century in the present. As the website of the Prime Minister's office declares, a fundamental goal of the year-long commemoration is to reconsider Japan's path since the Restoration so that the younger generations can glean lessons for the future. And its logo can be seen around Tokyo even today. But the lingering question is exactly what are those lessons? So after surveying the image of the ocean and the sea and connections to the Pacific at large framed by these events, I'd like to suggest what some of those takeaways might be. So my talk will be divided into three parts. First, I'm going to survey some of the Meiji 150 commemorative events in Japan and a bit abroad to identify how maritime affairs are presented and what their framing suggests about visions of Pacific engagement as a legacy of the Meiji period. For indeed, celebrations of the specific year of the Restoration, 1868, invariably expand into reflections on the Meiji era more broadly and expand even into the 20th century. In the second part, I'll shift to explore how Hokkaido 150th commemorations differ from that of the Meiji anniversary, focusing on portrayals of maritime affairs. And I'm focusing on Hokkaido not only because I'm living there in the midst of a convenient source base, but more importantly because research this past year reveals what I see as a pioneering role of Hokkaido in connecting larger Japan to the sea, specifically the Pacific, as Hokkaido was integrated into official sovereign territory. And finally, I'll offer some concluding thoughts on why these observations are important for understanding Japan today as a 21st century maritime nation. So is there anyone in here who's actually looked at the government Meiji 150 website? No? Okay, well, it's good that I'm beginning with that bit then. So at the bottom, some of you may have devices and surreptitiously look at it as I speak, and that's entirely fine. At the bottom of the page, you'll see the URL for the official website, which is a kind of sub-site of the Kante platform. And up top, as part of what kind of greets you when you click on that page, are these 4 panels which introduce you to the major segments of information and kind of introduce the structure of the site. And so for those of you who may not read Japanese, on the left we have an event calendar that lists events related to the Meiji 150th celebrations for the rest of the year, including today, for which 38 events are listed for April 2nd. Then there's a collection of digital archives. That's the kind of second frame. The kind of third category is major organizations that are kind of sponsoring related events. And finally, a series of links to other institutions, museums, including some government ministries that are organizing exhibitions and lectures as part of this year. So the site is primarily an aggregator, but to kind of presage or introduce the importance of this to the administration and the government, in his New Year's address in January, Abe opened with special mention of these events as opportunities to consider the spirit of Meiji and how it can help reinvigorate Japan today. And so for the next few minutes, I'll consider how the maritimization, as I've come to call it at some points, of Meiji Japan unfolded and how it continues to shape Japan today in significant ways. So in the midsection of the homepage, when you first go to the Meiji portal, at the top you have the 4 kind of categories of information, but in the center, you're greeted with the image that I've cut and pasted here, and that is the entryway into a photography archive. And what it says here are, let's look at the photographs to kind of reconsider and reflect on the memory of Meiji, and then the 2 kind of architectural pictures that are front and center here asks the kind of reader to consider or see if they can identify what the building and what the street is that's at the center. So Meiji Japan embraced a whole array of technologies to help visualize and record the natural environment, including photography and map making. And there are important exhibitions around Tokyo actually right now, one at the Camera Museum and one at the Nautical Archives of the Coast Guard that explore these topics. And these visual developments help us understand not only what Meiji Japan looked like, but also how contemporaries saw and understood it at the end of the 19th century. So the website here introduces us to the ocean on this very first page. Not only our initial glimpse of it, if we think about kind of visual depictions of the sea on the website and the kind of message this might subliminally communicate to the reader, we have one here on the left of the event calendar. It's a little bit unclear, and the attribution isn't listed on the site, but of some sort of kind of paddle wheel vessel at sea. But if we look at this photography portal, the architectural street scene images in the very center are on land, but the background is the ocean. In fact, 4 different versions of it that serve as a frame for the center images. And these kind of background ocean scenes are kind of subtle, unobtrusive, but literally all-encompassing as they surround the center images. And they each reveal these kind of small pieces of the sea. Now, clicking on this hyperlink in the center, and it's hard to tell here, but if some of you are on the site on your devices, these clicking on the images actually takes you to the photography collection. You end up here. And this is an archive featuring images from the 4 port cities of Nagasaki, Yokohama, Tokyo, and Hakodate, which you can see listed in the kind of bottom 4 quadrants. The selection of the capital city and the newly opened treaty ports may seem to be a given because there were so many photographers kind of stationed there, and they were also these kind of hubs of activity just as Japan opened its ocean borders. But if we scrutinize the 44 images, when you kind of go beyond this initial page, and it's a very kind of small, kind of select collection, 34% of the images include the ocean in some form, highlighting the role of these cities not just as trading hubs and receptors for foreign vessels coming in, but also as connectors linking Japan vessels going out to the Pacific. Now, the photographer behind the lens of many of these prints is unknown, so we cannot always identify if the individual operating the shutter was Japanese or not. But we do know that some of the photographers were Japanese, and the capture of a Japan extending onto the sea with a view originating on land with the ocean on the horizon, and I won't pull those images up here, showed multi-masted ships with Western-style rigging which could carry Japanese people and goods and ideas around the world's oceans. And today this is taken for granted, but at the time it was revolutionary. And this movement went from these ports around the corners of the Pacific, not only to China, west to Korea, and east to Hawaii, but also north to Russia, and also along the Great Circle route, taking vessels back to San Francisco. Now, the second area of the site where Maritime Meiji appears is in a nautical chart exhibit that's hosted by the Japanese Coast Guard Hydrographic Institute. This collection is a bit tucked away behind layers of portals, but it still offers an important way to engage the casual browser who might stop to think actually about a graphic image, but may not take the time to really dig into a textual document. Now, this nautical charts digital collection opens with a biography of the gentleman on the left, Yanagi Nariyoshi, who was the first director of the Department of Sea Routes, or hydrography, as it later came to be called, within the Naval Ministry, and has come to be known as the father of nautical surveying. He adds an important new name to the usual list of Meiji worthies. He's often referred to as well as the Ino Tarataka of the ocean or the sea. And for those of you not familiar, he was one of the most important cartographers of the 19th century before the Restoration, who created hundreds of maps that were drawn upon by later map makers to depict the landscape as well as the ocean. And so Yanagi was responsible for overseeing the surveying and then production of the first nautical charts in Japan. The very first one, which is a map of Kameishi Bay, which is outside Iwate Prefecture. So for those of you not familiar, heading up towards Tohoku, or the northern part of Honshu, which he collected measurements for on his way back from Hokkaido, which was actually the first stage of his initial surveying journey. And so this information and a kind of larger exhibition is highlighted in a special display at the Japanese Coast Guard archives off the Yuri Kamome line by the Telecom Center. And for those of you interested, I'd encourage you to go. They have very helpful staff who love nothing more than to spend hours taking visitors through the exhibit. So a key lesson from these two small examples of the ocean in Meiji 150 anniversary events is a growing interest in knowing the sea in the late 19th century, in studying its characteristics in different seasons in various regions of the Japanese islands, of exploring its depth and its chemistry, charting its tidal variations and offshore currents, as Japan transitioned from being minimally and selectively engaged in the Tokugawa period to complete openness to movement across the sea. Now, as the Japanese government platform has inserted ocean affairs in kind of a helter-skelter way, as you can see in this portal, Japanese historians, too, have been re-examining Meiji maritime history from new perspectives in the past several years. In 2015, one of the leading historical journals in Japan, Nihonshi Kinkyu, published a special edition titled Spatial Knowledge and Politics, The View from the 19th Century Sea, in which 4 leading historians shared essays on how connections to the deep sea contributed to the birth of the modern nation of Japan. 2 of these historians in particular, Sugimoto Fumiko at the University of Tokyo and Goto Atsushi at Kyoto Tachibana University have followed with other related work, including Sugimoto's recent article in an English language journal, Out from Sophia, Monumenta Nipponica, on artist Gonte Sadahide's bird-eye views of Japan during the time of the restoration. And I'm very happy to have the translator and the editor of the journal here tonight. At the end of this article, Sugimoto comments that a map of Japan printed in 1871 using this bird's eye perspective reflected, quote, the new importance of the Pacific Ocean as the stage of international politics and military movement and of maritime defense and trade. Sugimoto's work is so path-breaking, in fact, that at a Meiji 150 commemorative symposium held at Yale University in Connecticut last year, Sugimoto and her colleague at the University of Tokyo, Yoshida Nobuyuki, were part of a panel on the view from the sea during the restoration. These thumbnail sketches of the ocean and nautical maps in Meiji 150 celebrations position Japan as an important contributor to mapping the Pacific across the Meiji and into the 20th century. This commitment continues today not only in efforts to justify its own EEZ, its exclusive economic zone, and we have one image here on the left, to justify these dimensions as preparation for discussions with Russia, Korea, and China. But also these map-making efforts support global initiatives to understand rising and warming oceans. Recent mapping projects off of Fukushima and in the Akats region off of Hokkaido, which measure contaminants in the ocean, reveal that the Japanese government sees monitoring the sea environment as a core responsibility as a Pacific power. Leading the Pacific realm in 2018 means not only surviving the great power diplomatic competitions of the late 19th century, but rather in setting the agenda for monitoring and preserving the physical environment as well. And aside from the work with the Japanese Coast Guard Oceanographic Branch, scholars at the Low Temperature Research Institute at Hokkaido University and other Japanese institutions are constantly producing key maps of the polar regions as well, which are also important segments of the greater Pacific world. Now, I've just shared a few select observations on the Meiji Restoration 150 commemorations from the center, a kind of Tokyo-esque perspective. But for the next few minutes, I'd like to offer thoughts about how related events differ in Hokkaido, particularly in their memory and portrayal of the ocean. So the government website links to events in most prefectures of Japan, not only Yamaguchi and Kagoshima, the usual suspects, but many others as well. Hokkaido alone, of all Japan's prefectures and cities, is not framing 2018 events as part of the Meiji 150 celebrations, but rather as commemorations that celebrate Hokkaido's 150th birthday. And so here on the left, you can see the Hokkaido logo, again, after a very heated competition, apparently, which also, I think an interesting parallel to the Meiji 150 logo includes not only Japanese, but also kind of English tagline at the bottom, I think, to engage a larger audience. And on the right-hand side here, I have one of many images of the ocean, a variety of photographs on the website, which highlight Japan's connections to the sea in Hokkaido. And just to show you how Hokkaido stands out, again, I don't know how many of you can read Japanese, but this is a link on the government website to the variety of prefectural, so kind of local and regional level events related to the Meiji 150 year around Japan. And Hokkaido here, front and center at the top. You can see, 95% of the remainder mention Meiji 150 in some form. And Hokkaido alone has kind of titled their year of programming those of the Hokkaido 150th. So I find these events particularly interesting because of the book that I'm writing, in which I argue that the Hokkaido Maritime region, more than any other area of the archipelago, was responsible for launching Japan as a Pacific nation at the turn of the 20th century. But in addition to this academic side, there's a very curious and I think interesting commercial side as well in Hokkaido that we're not seeing in Tokyo. It was very evident on my trip down. You can see the airline attendant on the right. This is with Air Do, which is announcing the Air Do airline carrier's 20th anniversary, but also the Hokkaido 150th as well. And a variety of food products and children's clothing going from Asahi Superdry. You can see a little Hokkaido 50th logo here to mayonnaise and bread. It kind of catches you everywhere you turn, certainly in the city of Sapporo. But to return to a more serious note, in the digital, the kind of nautical map archives I mentioned above with Mr. Yanagi, Hokkaido emerges as central to engaging the ocean because its coastline was in fact the very first area in all of Japan to be mapped using trigonometrical measurement methods. And Yanagi's first extended voyage in his role as director was in fact a circumnavigation of the island of Hokkaido, a trip he chronicled in an important diary that I look forward to reading over the next couple of months. But the individual most important for promoting Hokkaido's international links to the Pacific was a man named Matsura Takashi, the core image, an individual at the center of Hokkaido's 150th promotional materials. The writings and maps of Matsura, who was an important explorer and cartographer of the late 19th century, embodied the idea of Ezo as not defined by its withdrawal from the sea, as was the rest of Japan, but rather defined by the continuing dynamism of its maritime interactions, which were ongoing from centuries before. Hokkaido's Pacific connections are not surprising, given that Hokkaido has the longest shoreline of any prefecture in Japan, roughly 4,500 kilometers, just about the same distance as the east coast of the United States. During the first few years of Meiji, with unrestricted ocean going, so many deaths occurred in Hokkaido at sea that the government in 1874 declared that boats under 74 tons, which is still quite large, were not allowed to be built, and started to subsidize the construction of Western sailing vessels, which led to the emergence of the southern port of Hakodate as a key shipbuilding site in Japan. Now, Hokkaido's engagement with the open sea is not surprising, given its long history, which I think many folks are not aware of, dating well before the Tokugawa period, of interactions, particularly those of the Ainu, the local indigenous population, with traders of the Northwest Pacific, with shipwrecked sailors from all around the world, and with Western explorers. Over centuries, these contacts created a maritime zone of interconnectivity and openness to exchange that didn't exist in the remainder of the Japanese islands, minus perhaps certain portions of the South. This tradition of engagement with the non-Hokkaido world created a receptivity to non-Japanese actors lacking in other Japanese islands of the Tokugawa archipelago, where the shogunate had strictly limited foreign affairs from the early 1600s. So Hokkaido, for most of its existence before the Meiji Restoration, when it was known as Ezo, was in fact not subject to the kind of closed country or sakoku policies of the Tokugawa, but the norm, in fact, was trade and interaction with a variety of peoples of the North Pacific world. Nowhere is this vision of a regionally engaged Hokkaido more evident than in Matsura's 1869 map of Hokkaido, which you see here on the left, which flipped the south up and the north down, so to speak. And so you see the island of Hokkaido. Here's Honshu, barely visible in the upper right-hand corner, and Hakodate about right here. And so then you have the island, the Asian mainland, the island of Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands extending to Kamchatka. With major landforms in this map, only on the margins. Here we see Sakhalin, over here on the right, and the Kuril Islands as unequivocally Japanese and part of Hokkaido. which certainly is much in dispute today. But the majority of the image is water space, with the Akatsuki Sea here in the center, bordered by Japanese territory. Now, one historian, a kind of important scholar of maps of this period, suggests this orientation portends a clash with Russia, since Japanese lands are kind of gobbling up the water space, much as the kind of video game figure Pac-Man. But I think this perspective also suggests Hokkaido's connections to spaces and peoples to the north, those connections to the north being just as important as its contacts to the south. And actually, roughly a third of the picture in the upper left-hand corner, where we see the kind of text and the Japanese characters, lays in the Pacific to the east of Hokkaido, pointing to the importance of maritime connections across the larger Pacific. And as you can see on the promotional materials from a series of events around the city, particularly one at Kinokuniya outside of Sapporo Station, that displayed a series of his writings, reproductions, and some originals. Up in the right-hand corner, you have a reproduction of this map, which has been kind of become a symbol of his kind of creative life and his contributions to helping Hokkaido think about its own past. But yet another, a bit of a side, but to demonstrate, I think, the depth to which Matsura and his writings and his kind of map creations have come to dominate the conversation, or at least to kind of symbolize the interpretation of the past that Hokkaido wants to remember. These are images from the Sapporo Snow Festival this year. And this is a kind of digital graphic artist rendering of the ice sculpture on the right, which shows a variety of animals indigenous to Hokkaido and his kind of birthday. Up here at the top, you have 150 celebration ice sculpture. And then in the bottom, there were a series of ice sculptures of Matsura around the Snow Festival. And this was one of several billboards featured in the kind of gathering areas of the kind of major park strip where the sculptures were situated. And so these little character figures representing Hokkaido are saying, oh, has it already been 150 years, really? But there's Matsura at their side, kind of engaging in conversation with them. But a second way that Matsura reflects the importance of the ocean in Hokkaido's past lies in the renaming of Ezo in 1868 as Hokkaido. And it's this moment that is really celebrated and highlighted in many of the promotional materials around the city. Now, the characters for Hokkaido, as many of you know, are north and ocean and kind of pathway or street or route. Though this final character was one of several that were used for kind of ancient administrative designation to name different regions in Japan. But this was only one of 6 different candidates that Matsura presented to the government for consideration as a new name for the island of Ezogashima. And the one that was finally selected was actually Hokkai. The do was added later to kind of make it kind of parallel and in sync with this more ancient tradition of regional naming. But the 2 characters, the 2 kind of Chinese symbols used for the sounds of kai in the center were the characters which had been used to represent the kind of Ainu, kind of indigenous culture's name for themselves. So they had a variety of words that were used to refer to their own people, and one of them was kai. And so you can see here a long history of Matsura's interaction with the kind of indigenous culture in Hokkaido, which kind of make him a kind of an agreed upon central figure for the 150th anniversary celebrations, was his kind of respect and deep reverence for the culture and lifestyle and contributions of the native peoples. And so the kai referring to the Ainu, or the kind of Ainu indigenous people of the north, was ultimately converted into the character for sea, which was used, you can see here, in two other of the suggestions that he gave to the government. And I think in pointing to the importance of the ocean and the sea and the kind of character and the history of the island, but also here interspersing that with the centrality of the contributions and the presence of the native Ainu. Yeah. So I think this naming, the fact that it originates at its beginning with a name that was used by the Ainu themselves, reminds us that a core reason for Hokkaido's historical link to the sea is because of the long-standing connections of this indigenous peoples with these traders, explorers, and shipwrecked sailors from around the North Pacific. So a couple of final thoughts before I wrap up and we can actually move to a discussion. Again, this is a short analysis of two very brief examples from a variety of events surrounding Hokkaido's 150th celebrations. But I think they represent a kind of larger image of the region as organically multicultural, international, and ethically diversified in a way that the kind of core Tokugawa realm was not. It was also an area more intimately connected to the larger Pacific. So in a way, Hokkaido becomes a pioneering example that the rest of the Japanese islands could mimic and aspire to after 1868. And in the conclusions that follow, I'd like to suggest that an important legacy of Hokkaido's Meiji experience is that it continues to be a key actor in Japan's Pacific engagement even today. I first really began to think about these ideas in February of this year when I read an article in The Economist magazine entitled, "After 150 Years, Why Does the Meiji Restoration Matter?" That it matters and that it's important is a bit of a non-question to historians. Some of my colleagues may disagree. But if we historians are going to maximize the utility of our discussions and findings, I think we should engage this question outside of the history echo chamber. The Meiji and Hokkaido logos each contain English taglines, as I mentioned earlier. So it seems that both celebrations want to engage an audience beyond Japan, beyond kind of exclusively Japanese language discussion base, and consider the broader global relevance of questions concerning the memory of the restoration. So the April 2018 edition of Chuo Koron leads with a special feature on all that is wrong with our interpretations of the Meiji Restoration. But it does not consider the place of the ocean. And I want to think about why it is absent. The scholars in this very long conversation-style interview in Chuo Koron couch much of their discussion as a reconsideration of the undoing of Sakoku. But if the literal significance was the ability to now travel abroad and across the ocean outside of Japan, where is consideration of what ocean-going movement meant for the Japan after 1868? The sea is without doubt a critical and politically charged arena in today's politics and diplomacy. In July of 2016, as he does every year, and each prime minister on Marine Day kind of delivers a statement to the press and the Japanese public, Abe said, quote, "Japan is a maritime nation that prides itself on a sea area which is the 6th largest in the world, approximately 12 times the size of our land area. The sea has since ancient times provided us with an abundance of food while serving as a medium for goods and people to come and go and a place for children both to play and learn. Japan attained its modernization by making use of the sea as it built up its industries. It is not an exaggeration to say that the sea has shaped Japan as a nation." But if that is the case, and it was so important to Meiji transformations, why has it not been featured more prominently in these commemorations? Perhaps one reason is to make the commemorations seem less politically agenda-driven, focusing on maritime affairs and ocean borders and the present would inevitably lead to discussions of ocean-centric disagreements with China, South Korea, and Russia. And this might make the commemoration seem even more like a political tool of the government. But at heart, engaging the Pacific meant globalizing. Japan in 2018 certainly needs to reinfuse society with excitement for the global, at a time when study abroad for university students is in decline, and the embrace of a culturally diverse society has yet to take root. But the Ministry of Education did recently insert extra coverage of world history in its secondary school curriculum in the middle schools, and the government is beginning to lower immigration barriers to increase the labor force, given the decreasing population. But how might these shifts occur more rapidly or more completely or with less resistance? The dizzying social changes of Meiji offer instructive lessons. But as food for thought, I'll close with 4 examples of how Hokkaido in 2018 offers important examples of embracing the global by engaging the oceans. One is the frequent discussion of visits by Japanese nationals to the Northern Territories. As we see here on the left during the Snow Festival, there are a variety of posters prominently displayed, some of them in the prefectural government buildings. There's a museum exhibition room donated to this, asking the viewing public to kind of think about the importance of returning these 2 islands at the southern tip of the Kurils to Japanese sovereignty. And so this is a kind of day-to-day issue, I think of great interest to the Japanese public, certainly in eastern Hokkaido, where there's a greater percentage of Japanese citizens who at some time actually lived on the southern tip of the Kurils or had ancestors and relatives who did. A second episode in which Hokkaido recently has been thinking about its engagement with its neighboring nations and countries through the ocean is the kind of drifting ashore of North Korean fishing boats during the fall, and particularly in the recent press, the trial of a fishing captain in Hakodate who came ashore on an island just off of Matsura with his crew and actually kind of stole a variety of electronic goods and some copper and materials from solar panels on the island while we were there, and who has actually been given a suspended sentence, I think in part because of the kind of empathy of the judge for the kind of humanitarian plight of the crew and their countrymen back at home. A third event in the press that got a fair amount of attention and I think makes Hokkaido residents think about their connections to the Pacific at large was coverage of a trip by fisheries high school students this spring on their annual kind of month-long practical vessel training to go after maguro, but which made their way to the island of Palau as part of a kind of student exchange and a way of revisiting kind of Japan's wartime experience. And so these conversations too were on the tip of the tongue of many residents in Hokkaido. And finally, I should say, a kind of internal topic of conversation is will Abe and Putin actually consider building these bridges that connect Sakhalin to the mainland and then southern Sakhalin to Hokkaido. Wakanai you see here at the bottom, which would literally make Hokkaido a bridge to its Pacific neighbors and the future of friendly relations. So Hokkaido continues its role of building economic and political ties through exchange across the Pacific, continuing its early Meiji initiatives and those that extend into the 20th century. So I'll leave you with a question the Prime Minister's official Meiji 150 website poses. What do you think are the most important legacies of the restoration for Japan's continuing role as a Pacific nation in the 21st century? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noel. Before we go to the Q&A session, I'll take the advantage of controlling the microphone to ask a question and make a comment. It's interesting, I've been to Hokkaido many times. No one has ever talked to me about the Northern Territories. No, I mean, the other thing, and is also, I've never heard anybody in Japan mention the anniversary of Meiji. I mean, I go to lots of meetings, dinners,
Yes,
luncheons.
yes.
Most of the people I interact with.
We're already 4 months in, right?
You know, I think you're from Mississippi. Well, or you teach in Mississippi. I'm assuming that on the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, it would be a topic of discussion.
Yes.
I mean, people will be aware of it. I mean, so that's kind of my comments. Now, the way the Q&A session works, Noel will recognize you, and you can walk up to the mic if you want to be recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, speak from your chair. The advantage of speaking from the mic is that we hear you better.
Okay.
So raise your hands or both hands.
My name is Makoto Honjo. I have two just observations. These are not questions. When I looked at the Japanese government website, I was struck by the fact that Kobe was not present in that 4 ports. And also, when they listed all the prefectural links, Tokyo doesn't have a Meiji 150 website, apparently. And that really struck me.
Yeah, interesting. As a new capital, I don't know what to say about Kobe, except I'm not a photography expert. I have colleagues in the room who may know better because of recent digitization programs. But I think that Kobe, my assumption, perhaps wrong, have the same number of photographers shooting. So there just wasn't a kind of core collection of photographs to pull from. For this little exhibit, which is very selective. I mean, it's kind of, again, helter-skelter. I don't know exactly the logic of how certain images were chosen. It might have to do with kind of copyright concerns, I don't know, or the cooperation of different libraries. But yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't know if other folks in the room have ideas about why that might be. We can share a microphone if you want.
Gilles Campagnolo from French National Center for Scientific Research, and also a professor at Hokkaido at the point. Well, maybe one hypothesis for Kobe is that it's on the inland sea. So of course, it's been related, like Nagasaki, to trade with China, etc. But it may not necessarily have the same image of opening to the outside that the sea has. And that will be my question, my impression about Japan and the sea. It's rather that it would usually, and the Sakoku years are proof of that, turn its back to the sea. Of course, it's very beautiful to have pictures like the one you showed, or like for now at they've just opened this Kabuki month's stage with Saigo and Katsu at the time when the Edo-jo was taken, and there is the Saigo Takamori Yashiki that has a very beautiful view of the Tokyo Bay because it was located in what's now Shinagawa. But that's about it. And maybe there is a hint, so what would you do of that remark? Maybe there is a hint that Japan is looking inward to its lands, forests, mountains, more than to the sea, in the fact that when they, as you stress, Hokkaido is very important for the sea. But to many Japanese, Hokkaido is coming after and is a different Japan than Japan. So the fact that Hokkaido and the sea are related would come rather as a proof that Japan and the sea may not go together that well. It's also the only place where the Meiji 150 is changed into Hokkaido 150. So what do you make of that remark, that maybe your topic in itself suggests there are hints to the way around? That would be my question.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll see if I took away what you meant to express. I mean, first with Kobe, I'm happy that Kobe's not there because it helps prove my case. I mean, I didn't have to overlook evidence because it was inconvenient since it was on a kind of more inland area. I'll have to talk with some Kobe historians and see what they say about that. But yeah, in terms of kind of Ezo or Hokkaido being a separate case for Japan, I mean, I guess part of the argument that I'm trying to develop are the ways in the Meiji period moving into the 20th century that this culture or tradition of interconnectivity and kind of openness to kind of maritime interactions of all different sorts in the north of Japan could be not exactly, a template, but kind of suggestive or instructive or encouraging for the kind of central Japanese islands that have been part of the Tokugawa realm to, embrace. I mean, of course, in terms of, cultural sensitivity and diversification, I mean, very quickly, the Ainu were not treated in a way that revered their traditions as Matsura had. So it kind of flipped this local indigenous, history on its head a bit. I mean, as the Meiji government was much slower to kind of latch on and maybe celebrate this tradition in Ezo. I don't know if that gets at your question. I mean, I guess you're saying that the case of Hokkaido, which was the kind of last territory to join kind of Japan's, kind of sovereign integral lands, and as the kind of most northernmost territory, was kind of a case apart. So in some ways, shouldn't be discussed in the same breath as Japan as a whole. But the idea is that with Meiji that they were integrated. So kind of how to kind of explain and I think analyze that merging of essentially two different cultures in a new unified state. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Hiroki Sugita. I'm a Japanese journalist. The other island which came late as a part of Japan is Okinawa. Yes. So if we didn't have if we didn't annex Hokkaido and Okinawa, both of two latecomers, what do you think that I mean, Honshu and the other, for only three islands, Japan would make Japan in terms of the to what extent, to what level of extent, to what extent that Japan can say that itself as the maritime power?
If it did not include,
if we don't have Hokkaido and Okinawa, then that what the form of the Japan, only three islands, three major islands, makes Japan's nature or character as the maritime nation or maritime state?
That's a very interesting question. I'm going to go back to this slide where I had an image of Japan's exclusive economic zone, because what first jumps out at me, if Okinawa were not included, any of these, I mean, it would take away, I don't know exactly how the lines would work out, but maybe kind of half of the ocean space that's considered sovereign territory today. And in terms of resource extraction, oil exploration, fishing rights, I guess, seaweed farms and that sort of thing. I think it would have made, I mean, in terms of military might, I've never thought about this question, but I think it's very interesting. I think, Japan takes great pride. A previous speaker, I don't know if it was here in the U.S. as part of an ICAS talk, was a historian at the University of Connecticut, Alexis Dudden, in the past, who's writing a book about this exact topic, about the kind of importance of the fact that some kind of 12 times Japan's, in terms of sovereign territory, 12 times its kind of land area is the ocean waters that it considers kind of sovereign, as part of its sovereign realm. So I think it would mean a lot initially in terms of fishing. I guess one of the questions is, in terms of maritime power, then who would have controlled those? Would have they been independent? Would have been China or Russia stepping in to take control, or another country? I think those are the most likely suspects. Certainly, you know, if mainland China had other kind of island territories out here in the Pacific, I think that would make relations much tenser. Yeah, I'll have to mull that over, but I like the hypothetical. Yes?
Magna Kano, a longtime resident. I'm wondering, I'm working my way through Amino Yoshihiko's Re-envisioning Japanese History, University of Michigan Press book. You're nodding your head in a strange way. He was attributing the lack of emphasis on the sea to the Confucian view of society held by the Tokugawa, where the farmer who was growing the grain was most important. And for the Tokugawa, it was just those pesky pirates surrounding the entire island chain down into the Philippines, who they didn't want to think about because they weren't controlling them properly. But I think there's a lot more that can be explored in that direction about how the official Tokugawa history and a more grassroots up view of history would fit together.
Yeah, that's maybe an interesting tension. So you're suggesting that from an official level, I mean, other historians have noted as well, as the kind of tax revenue, I mean, the major source of income to the kind of central government at the time was from, was rice taxes, and Hokkaido was more or less too cold, even if that, or Ezo at the time, had been part of sovereign territory. It would have been tough to kind of extract a
Amino
similar
has
percentage.
gone through tax records and said, okay, this island was assessed at so much rice. You can't grow rice on that. They would take the salt that they produced on that island to Kobe, get it exchanged there, and it was a big local exchange port rather than overseas as much. And the trade around the edges of the islands was very strong. It's an interesting book, and University of Michigan Press.
Well, I think, I'm not sure quite how to respond, I suppose, but you know, this idea of sakoku, there's some historians that posit this distinction between a near and a far sea. If you think of Japan as kind of completely being walled off from the ocean, I mean, the near sea was incredibly dynamic. I mean, as part of my own work, I've been looking at these kind of coastal traders going up from the inland sea all around Hokkaido and even as far as Etorofu here. So whaling captains would come in and I think be very interested in trying to hire some of these local coastal traders to come on their vessels because they knew the kind of currents and the wind patterns and the safe straits to go through heading up into the Kuril Islands on their whaling voyages. But you know, it's when you get into the deep sea, beyond sight of land, that the Japanese weren't really, you know, integrated into ocean travel. So in terms of the, you know, fishermen and the little merchant and the village on the seashore, they were very connected to the sea. And so I think we have to make this distinction between the kind of proximal oceans within sight of land and what we might call the high seas here.
Hi, good to see the Demon Deacons representing here tonight.
I wondered if that was you. It's been a while.
It's been a long time, 25 years. One of the things I was curious about is one of the biggest issues right now is climate change. That's changing dramatically the types of fishing, the types of things that Hokkaido will do around the area. But I don't ever see that actually in the news. I don't see, I mean, I actually hear people talking about they're changing the way they're procuring their seafood that used to come from Hokkaido just because it is making a huge impact. Now, you're talking about whaling. I'm very curious to hear about your new book, but that's something I would expect Japan to be a bit more on the forefront, at least in the international community, about climate change and how it's impacting, global fisheries and a number of parts, because that impacts Hokkaido directly. So.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. I kind of skipped over. I went a little long just because I extemporized a little bit with slides more than I had in my notes. But it's in the press a lot in Hokkaido. I mean, certainly the squid stocks, how they're moving north. So many of the fishing villages like Muroran, Esashi, Hakodate. So in the southern, maybe the southern half of the island of Hakodate, which are historically squid fishing ports. And this is a very, maybe kind of like personal, what should I say, kind of very jarring revelation to me, because my very first ever image of Japan was not of the mountains, because I came in at night into Hakodate on my first trip as a freshman in college, and I saw the squid boats out at sea, and so this was in June, and so you saw these just really mysterious, I mean, look kind of like alien forces had landed out in the ocean, because they had these, really powerful bulbs under the boats to pull the squid in. But that now many of the fishing villages, I mean, including larger cities such as Muroran, but many small ones as well, who are, the livelihood of a huge part of the population is at stake unless they decide, where their families have lived for generations, to move to the northern side, maybe Abashiri on the Akatsi side of Hokkaido, because they're no longer going to be able to fish, squid. I mean, I think the gas costs of going out hundreds of miles when they used to be just kind of right out in the bay are too great. And also the salmon stocks. Hokkaido has really extraordinary salmon, but recent studies out from researchers at Hokkaido University and other fisheries institutions say that the salmon can kind of get out to sea, but because with the timing of their kind of seasonal travel, when they kind of come back into the rivers, the water temperatures are now so high that they aren't able to survive the trip back. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be hugely important, and I think there's a tremendous amount of work being done all over Japan, but certainly in Hokkaido, it's very apparent, and it's in the news all the time.
This is related to Sugita-san's question. It's interesting, if you think of it, Hokkaido and Okinawa are both new to Japan as a territory. I mean, if you look at the territory of Edo, Japan, in many ways, Hokkaido is even more new because there were very few Japanese there. The ties were not as close as they were between the Ryukyus. But I think the impression here, both among Japanese and foreigners, that Hokkaido is part of one of the 4 home islands, and Okinawa isn't. Now, obviously, there's the fact that Okinawa was under U.S. occupation much longer, but why is that? Why are these two extremities of the country perceived so differently, even though they both joined what became the contemporary Japanese state more or less at the same time?
Wow. Again, I can kind of shoot from the hip a bit. These things have been at the back of my head for sure. I think one consideration is the importance of Hokkaido being protected as a buffer zone for the mainland against Russia, which for the majority of the period since the Meiji Restoration, I think was considered a greater security concern to Japan than China may be now, coming from Taiwan and the Senkakus up to Okinawa. And so as quickly as possible, I think at least whether or not the kind of local residents in Hokkaido felt integrated in the kind of Japanese polity and society and culture as kind of full citizens, whatever that means, that the Japanese population at large, certainly in Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, felt that they were committed to the safety and security of the island was important to the central government. Though, I mean, I have heard some people say that, when the missiles went over Cape Erimo here at the southern tip of Hokkaido in the fall, I think there are many reasons that Kim Jong-un chose that trajectory, but one of them is like, well, yeah, the Japanese, if something happens to Hokkaido, no big deal. I mean, there's a lot of space, not that many people, so it wouldn't be as big of a concern. You know, like the one that went to Guam that flew over, you know, mainland Japan. So, yeah, I'd be curious to know what others think as well. Yeah, Okinawa, I don't know. I mean, even now, I think the importance of feeling, at least for the government and the Japanese population at large, that Hokkaido is inextricably 100% kind of same category as the rest of the islands integrated into sovereign territory is important, you know, because of kind of Russian maneuvers in the Kurils. And I keep seeing pop up that, you know, Putin says he'll never return them because of the possibility of the U.S. putting military bases on one of those islands, were they to, you know, return to Japanese sovereignty. I think part of it too maybe has to do with the kind of ethnic makeup of the islands. I mean, so much of the Ainu population has intermarried, so there's not a kind of very, I mean, from my travels, and granted I haven't been all over the island, but of this distinction of different kind of peoples or races, or even cultures, intermingling and coexisting in Hokkaido the way that there seems to be in Okinawa, even if the Americans were not there. But that's just kind of speculation. I'd be curious if others have thoughts about that as well. Yes?
Just a comment on another big difference another big difference between the two is that the fact that in the last part of the Pacific War, Okinawa was essentially sacrificed, and the people of Okinawa were sacrificed, and they were essentially lied to by the central government, and, you know, asked to make tremendous sacrifice in the face of invasion there. And that's an experience that the population of Hokkaido has never been through. And as a result of that, I think that creates a divide between modern Japan and modern Okinawa that doesn't exist between modern Japan and modern Hokkaido. And, you know, if you're going to compare those two, you probably ought to throw in Taiwan and compare that too, because that's more contemporary to Hokkaido becoming part of Japan than Okinawa was, which was, what, a century earlier, right? Anyway, just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, no, thank you for that comment. In the fall, I saw a very interesting documentary about Okinawa's first Diet member. So, アメリカ米軍に一番恐れた人? Kamejiro? Has anyone seen this documentary? About the first Diet member from Okinawa. It made the rounds in a few kind of art house cinemas. But there was a section of the film that covers a reversion in 1972, and there were all these, you know, celebrations in Tokyo with the prime minister and dignitaries, et cetera, and galas and dinners. And so many Okinawans that were interviewed were like, what is a celebration? So you promise us that when we returned to become part of kind of Japanese territory, that these bases would no longer be here. So beyond the war itself, but extending into the 1970s. And in fact, we don't want to return until they're gone. And that will be the true cause for celebration. So yeah, that's an interesting angle. I mean, I think there is more resistance, well, I don't know, resistance, but kind of reticence or pushback, yeah, in Okinawa even today in the way there's not in Hokkaido, unless the ospreys come flying around, which they do occasionally.
Thank you for your great presentation. Actually, I acknowledge that, or I recognize that. So, this year is the 150 year of the anniversary of my major restoration, because I watched your presentation. However, I think the reason why I say 150 year anniversary is not very kind of popular among the Japanese people. It's not a very good business chance compared with Tokyo Olympics.
One of the reasons is. By the way, and I have two questions. Questions or comment. One is comment. You know, do you know Haihan Shiken? Haihan Shiken is a kind of, local government returned from road to the prefecture. Is probably Meiji 5, I don't remember. But, 146 or 5 years ago. But, local governments, make present, celebration of, 150 year of anniversary. It's very interesting. So why? And actually, and the major restoration is return from domestically, return from Tokugawa family to imperial family. It's a kind of but in Japan compared. I'm sorry, but compared to the Britain, imperial family not very very popular. That's why in my impression is that this event or celebration is not very very popular among Japanese people. What do you think about these domestic situation and related to international situation?
Yeah, that's really observant. I mean, yeah, I do think it's been overshadowed a bit. Certainly, I mean, it's sexier and more exciting for the younger generation to think about the Olympics than it is to think about, the 1860s. I think folks are a little bit skittish to get excited about it for a variety of reasons. I mean, certainly there's colonialism. I mean, I think many really balanced responses to the whole set of events, talk about the successes and failures and the things we should celebrate and those that, Japanese should kind of re-examine in their past. But, in terms of the emperor, so the piece in The Economist, and any of you can go online from early February and track that down, suggested that was one of the reasons for the reluctance of there to be not to be more hoopla in the press or in society about the 150th anniversary. But I think part of the reason might be that the government, or at least the Prime Minister's office, I don't know what individuals exactly in which ministries have been spearheading this, kind of took the lead in launching some sort of celebration. So maybe it feels, regardless of what political agendas might be at play, that this is a kind of top-down, instead of organically, I don't know, somehow, and in variety in the U.S. and Europe and Canada, there have been, and in Japan as well, a set, scholarly conferences and symposia, and their books coming out with essays, re-examining the meaning of the Meiji Restoration. But for society at large, we're kind of non-academic and not connected to historians and universities, maybe it doesn't seem that relevant. And certainly if it's something that the government is pushing, that makes people all the more apt to kind of ignore it. So, I mean, this has been a pretty eventful year in Japan with kind of government, scandal and the kind of transfer of the head of the imperial family. So, and certainly in Sapporo, I was a little surprised at how much attention these events receive, in spite of the fact that the city itself, even though it's about Hokkaido at large, majority of the population is in the greater Sapporo metro area, and the city is considering a bid for the 2026 Winter Olympics, which was a huge deal, especially as this year's Winter Olympics were going on in South Korea, with a whole host of events around the city. But it seems likely that maybe that's not going to be punted at least till 2030. And so it'll be out of the picture, and the kind of Hokkaido 150 events will take center stage again. But that's a question actually Robert and I were talking about earlier today, why a lot of folks very connected to universities and kind of historical commemoration aren't really aware of events and the kind of significance that I think the government would like to bring to this celebration. So yeah, I'd be curious to know what others think about that as well.
My name is Kurt Sieber. I'm from the Austrian Business Council. I have 3 questions, comments, whatever you look at it for. First, I was in Japan in 1968, and I do not recall that there was any big story about the 100th anniversary. How do you compare the situation in 1968 as compared now to 2018? That's my first question. The second question, and that is well connected with what has already been discussed. I mean, in history there is a big story about the possibility of Russia not only invading the northern territories, but to go for Hokkaido as a whole. And this is a very hot point. Some Americans tell me that the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima is actually the reason the war was very quickly ended, and that prevented the Russians then from getting into Hokkaido, which would have been a really major loss for Japan, because it wouldn't have come back so easily as we see now with the northern territories, like Okinawa came back from the United States. That's number 2. And number 3 is, what is the interest of the Hokkaido people today in the northern territories? I attended a press conference of Muneo Suzuki, who is a famous man in Hokkaido, and I think his daughter is now in the Diet. And he told us that the only thing the Hokkaido people are interested these days is to visit the graveyards of their ancestors, and nobody would have the slightest idea to move back to the northern territories, because they feel very, very well in the rest of Japan, and of course particularly in Hokkaido. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you for those questions. Well, maybe I'll go in reverse order so I can remember all 3 of them. Yeah, among the Hokkaido population, I mean, it's hard to say because all I have is anecdotal evidence, and I haven't done like a survey, and there's anything in the newspaper. I'm sure there are periodically, but not that I'm aware of. I just sense that it's a very visible presence, and certainly the Hokkaido Shimbun, which folks might say is representing the Hokkaido or kind of government spin on things, seems to cover these visits, a fair amount and keep it in the public eye, and around the city in unexpected places. So the image I showed earlier from the snow festival, the little kind of side poster about the return, you see them, around the city, and certainly, I mean, in the prefectural, so the Aka Renga, the previous kind of Meiji period brick building in the center, which housed the government for several decades and now houses the Hokkaido archives, has a room devoted to this question. Yeah, that's interesting. I do sense folks have this kind of nostalgia, which in real life, would there be hundreds or thousands? I mean, at the moment, I think the population of these islands is not even altogether, 5,000? I mean, it's very, very small. If there would be volunteers to go and, live there, be the pioneers, the Tondenhei of the Meiji period that went up to Hokkaido, I agree with that. Though, it keeps popping up in public conversation. It's not about the Kurils or the Northern Territories, but certainly, Sakhalin has been more of a conversation topic recently because of this last film in a 3-part, in a trilogy, the Kita no Sakuramori, which is about the escape of a Japanese family from Sakhalin at the end of the war who come to live in Abashiri up on the Akatsuki side, the northern side of the island. So, yeah, I mean, I guess it's symbolic. I think it might be one of those issues that both sides agree to disagree. I mean, because of concerns, I mean, recently in the press, there have been reports, certainly, you know, locally in Hokkaido, of, you know, Russian maneuvers in that area of the ocean. These folks would know better than I'm certain. And the fact that they'll never, you know, return them because of the possibility of a U.S. Base. So yeah, I think that's a good point. But I do think there are many Japanese citizens groups in Eastern Hokkaido who are very committed to kind of people-to-people, you know, informal exchange with Russians and, you know, kind of going over and sharing meals and kind of keeping this informal interaction as a way to kind of maintain contact. Even when at a diplomatic official level, things can get pretty cold. Second question, I think, was about what if Russia had invaded Hokkaido during the war. Wow. Well, at the very end of the war. And so again, in this film, I mean, this is a fictional, dramatic, over-the-top rendering of that period. But when the father in the family in Sakhalin kind of goes off to fight, I mean, he's essentially, you know, saying that he's going to sacrifice himself to prevent the Russians from getting down to Hokkaido. Wow, you know, the strait is very, very narrow there. If the Russians had actually taken over Hokkaido, I mean, I think that opens up a massive conversation. In the summer, the fighting wouldn't be so tough. The winter would have, but I mean, the timing when it fell in the year in August probably wouldn't have made it so difficult because you wouldn't have to deal with the snow and the really, you know, harsh conditions of November, December, January. But yeah, I don't know what to say exactly. I mean, you can think a little bit about this, the distance across the strait here and not being very popular, but certainly if it had been taken over and then populated by Russians in a way that was, you know, really dense and substantial, that could have, I don't know, made the resolution of the war and the occupation very different for sure, for the Americans too. The final question about, but I'd like to revisit that question, but I'd have to think more about it, about how the 1968 commemoration, the 100-year centennial, is different from this year. Some of my colleagues have studied that a fair amount. I mean, I can only speculate that so close to the end of the war, really digging into the meaning in a substantial way would have brought up a lot of very kind of delicate tensions over colonialism and Japan's militarization, because that was so recent in the past. But also, I suppose, during Japan's era of high economic growth, a topic that was very likely to be divisive and to kind of, in terms of a previous comment about Meiji Restoration commemorations not being a very good business opportunity, or maybe having a commercial, profitable angle to them. In 1968, I could see that even more when Japan was so focused on its economic development that spending kind of energy and time and investing a lot of effort and creating a lot of hoopla just wasn't where, I don't know, maybe the government, the population wanted to direct their attentions. But I actually haven't studied it. I have a colleague, actually back at Wake Forest, Kevin, Rob Hellier, who's in Kyoto this year, who has done some work on that. But that would just be my kind of offhand, maybe thoughts about the difference.
Since we're on the topic of the commemoration of Meiji, I was struck that when you showed that portrait of Emperor Meiji and his family, is how Western he looks. You know, it's a totally, to me what's striking is both commemoration of a Japanese event, but of the willingness to, in a way, abandon Japanese tradition. I used to have in my office a portrait of General Nogi, and one of my interns asked me whether it was my grandfather, and I said no. And you know, you look at him, there's nothing Western in that portrait of him. I mean, if you look closely, he looks a little Asian, but the beard, everything, the uniform. So it's, I think what's fascinating with this is that it's kind of unique case of a country willingly abandoning an enormous amount of its tradition and adopting a foreign tradition, of course, partly under foreign pressure. There were the unequal treaties, but Japan wasn't colonized in the sense there were no foreigners occupying the entire country. And I wonder how much that enters the discourse and how Meiji is really a break from the past and the arrival of so much Western tradition. That means that Japan is now, there's almost no link between the post-Meiji era and the pre-Meiji era in many areas, if you think, for example, of the legal system.
Well, that's one of the eternal tensions in historical study. I think the pull between continuity and rupture, right, at any time. I didn't choose this image. This is what was published in the Economist magazine, along with the article from February. But I do find it interesting. I mean, I think for so many Japanese and non-Japanese today that the imperial family and tradition is this receptacle of custom and history. I mean, it's an invented tradition in many ways, but this even more so. I mean, if you were to send out this image as part of a survey to assess support for the imperial house among Japanese today, I can imagine there'd be lots of Japanese students who wouldn't even identify this as the emperor. So, but yeah, the Westernization bit is very interesting. I mean, one of the lessons over thinking through some of these topics for a few days recently is the kind of speed and the rapidity and the scale of change. As many historians point out, there are lots of comparisons to modern China as only kind of even remote kind of parallel in the scope of the transformations. But where was I going with that? I lost my thought. I had one final point I wanted to make on that issue. Oh, yeah, but so when I was at the kind of Coast Guard archives this morning, and the kind of creator of the kind of Japanese nautical map tradition from the Meiji period, and several written documents, he states that one of his goals as the head of this agency was to, as quickly as possible, train, Japanese so they could kind of internalize and be kind of, self-sufficient. I mean, it's this backlash that many historians point to in the Meiji period of this kind of wholesale, uncritical embrace of everything Western and the hiring of foreigners, and then suddenly a little bit of self-reflection and this interest in becoming autonomous and independent again. And that happened too. I mean, I think a new example to me is what happened with ocean map making in the Naval Ministry. So I don't know if that gets at your question, but yeah, this question of continuity and change, and to which was most important and which was most momentous. I don't think that's a kind of internal question.
Well, thank you very much. We've reached the end of the session, but if you have any concluding remarks or you want to...
No, well, I guess just to say that if any of you individually have other comments or thoughts about this topic, certainly I'm trying to get my finger on the pulse of kind of the Japanese population at large in different areas of Japan. Certainly I think it's region specific in a way, maybe not in Tokyo, but certainly in Yamaguchi and Kagoshima. I haven't been recently, but I'd be very curious to know if the local population is more aware, just because of the individuals important to this period that came from those prefectures. But yeah, if you just have any individual comments and like to share, I'd love to hear them. And thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you also to Emily, to Eriko, and to all the student workers. So thanks again. And we have an event on sanctions on April 5th on the impact of sanctions on Russia, Iran, and other countries, both American and international sanctions on business, in particular on Japanese business.